better start, right? Is that my key? I'm still 35 seconds early, so there may be some people drifting in. My name is Mark Thorpe. This is a kind of a personal story today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about a big gold mine that I worked at, about 2 hours drive north of Acapulco. And it's relevant because we're heading into Acapulco and we're going to be in Guerrero State. Guerrero means warrior, and that's the state that we're going to be in. And from 2015 to 2019, I worked and lived I didn't quite live there all the time, but I spent a very large amount of time at the El Limon Guajes gold mine. And the gold mine itself, this is just a little bit about Estado Guerrero. We're coming into Acapulco right in about here. And Estado Guerrero is right in the heart of Mexico. It would do as a little thought to really take in the scale of Mexico. Since we left Los Angeles, 3 days ago? We've had a little bit of time in the US. And then since then, we've been coming down the Mexican coast. Yeah, we had a little bit of a deviation around the storm, but the scale of Mexico is quite huge, and it's quite interesting. Guerrero itself is a very mountainous state. This is the location of a place called Chilpancingo, right in the middle here. You can see there's a fringe of coast, and we're going to be in the Acapulco Bay area. But the rest of it is huge mountains. These are the Sierra Madres, and this is the Sierra Madre del Sur. It's got a long history of mining, dating back into the 1700s and prior. And it's also, everybody sees the coast of Guerrero, and it's not just the coast. This town here behind the flag is a place called Iguala, and that was the place where the Mexican flag was developed. So the Mexican flag, this is about an hour north of the mine that I'll be talking about today. You've got beautiful old towns and beautiful old towns that were silver mined. This is Tasco. This is a very famous silver mining area in Guerrero. It's an old town. They're still mining silver today, and they've been mining silver there for about 200 years. So we've got, obviously, the coast as well, and people might know Zihuatanejo as well as Acapulco. I wasn't going to talk too much about Acapulco because Richard did a nice little job the other day. I want to give you a little bit of background on Guerrero State, and these are some data that put kind of the ranking of the state into perspective. GDP is about 20 billion US, but it's 24th out of 32 states. When I started working there in 2015, it was 31st out of 22 states. The per capita GDP, that's how much people earn, $5,000 a year. That's in the less than half of the national average for Mexico. It makes a lot of money from tourism, which is its economic driver, particularly on the coast, Zihuatanejo, Manzanillo, and Acapulco. Acapulco was, in the day, in the 60s, and those of you who are going to see the cliff diving in the Quebrada tomorrow, Acapulco was part of the jet set. My granny from England was in Acapulco in the 60s. And I remember her bringing back the photographs of the Quebrada. So when I went to visit the Quebrada and see the cliff divers, it brought back memories of what my gran did. The Human Development Index, which is a measure of the development of things like education and that kind of thing, it's 30th out of the state, very, very high poverty rate, and a very, very high informal labor rate. There's a lot of people work in farming, a lot of people work in jobs that are not part of the kind of the official community. It's very difficult to get around inside of the state. You've got 2 or 3 main highways, and then once you get off the main highways, it's hours and hours and hours of twisty roads, to get things in. And I'll show you the mine, and I'll show you where we actually had to bring stuff into. So if you look at the state itself, here's Acapulco, where we're going tomorrow. Chilpancingo, which is the capital city. Spent a lot of time in there working with the government. And then the mine itself is right up here, up to Mexico City. You might know Cuernavaca, which is the city of eternal spring, for those of you who have been in the inside of Mexico. Zooming down a little bit at the mine, you can see this blob on the map is actually the mine. There's another big mine right here. And if we look, the place that I mentioned about where the flag was formed is this Iguala right here. And this place, Cocula, is a bit infamous. It's about 35 minutes, 40 minutes north of the mine. It was infamous because several years ago there were a group of 43 students that disappeared. I don't know if you recall that. They were actually up in Iguala, and it's thought they disappeared in Cocula. They have never found them. They've never found anything about them. So it gives you an idea of the kind of area in which we're working. This is a fairly early shot of the mine. We've got a large dam, reservoir here. There's a river here, the Rio Balsas, and there's a couple of towns here, La Fundición, Real de Limón, that we'll talk about right now. So the mine itself, we started building it in 2014, so I came to the mine about halfway through the build. It was a 2-year build, cost about $800 million to build it. It's quite an interesting project. It was very isolated. The only way to get into the mine at the start was through Iguala to Cocula. And the Iguala to Cocula road reminds me of a serpent. It just goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And we had to bring in big, very, very big pieces of equipment down this road. We had to do things like convoying in equipment. You'll see here a little bit of the layout of the mine. There's a very interesting thing here called a rope conveyor. It takes the ore from a crusher here down to a stockpile, and this is the processing plant here down on the bottom. My office was right in that building right there. So this is a very personal story that I'm sharing with you today. So the mine itself is a large open pit. These things that look like little castles, like we saw today, earlier today on the Inca temples, these are actually called benches, and you mine a bench at a time. So you go down probably 20 meters in this particular case, each one of these. And you can see here, these are big pieces of equipment all the way in the bottom of the mine. It's a great big hole. There's a lot of mining, and we use a lot of explosives in order to get this to move. But my wife still really likes gold, and we need gold for our cell phones and other things. So there's still a demand for metals and mining. In fact, if you look around the ship, almost apart from the stuff that's in the buffet, everything was either mined or dug out of the ground as oil. The whole ship infrastructure. Even some of your stuff that's on your buffet was mined because you've got salt to put on your food. That was mined. I remember seeing in one of the supermarkets in the US, there was a little jar of Himalayan salt. Now the Himalayan salt has been there for 50 million years. It was deposited a long time ago. They dug it up. And on the side of the little bottle that we got the salt in, there was an expiry date. 3 months it expired, so I'm glad they got it out of the ground. 50 million years in 3 months, and we would have been done. Anyway, always be aware, the expiry date is just a suggestion. I can't get my kids to think about that, When they see the milk and it says, sell before, they think it's done. They're not going to go near it, so I end up drinking a lot of milk that's supposedly expired. Having a look at a bench. This is the mining aspect, okay? This is a drill, and they drill these holes all the way along here, and then fill the holes with explosives, and it goes boom, and then we get either ore or waste. And yes, that's me standing there. at the time with Alfonso. He was the mine manager. So you get the ore, and you have to get the ore from chunks about kind of this big down to a fine sand in order to process it, in order to get the gold out of it. This is not gold like Richard was talking about with veins where you can probably see the gold occasionally. Right? This is gold which is scattered through the rock. In this particular case, it was about 2.6 grams a ton, 30 grams to an ounce. Your ring is probably 19 grams of gold in it, something like that, unless you've got a big, NBA championship ring, and then it's got a lot more. So we blast this stuff, and then we have to get the size down. We use things called mills. So these are actually mills, and there's two different types of mills. And I like to liken these mills to your laundry area in your house. So they have a mill called the sag mill, which is technical. I'm going to get technical. I did one technical thing for you yesterday. Semi-autogenous grind, which means it kind of smashes itself to bits. And this is the sag mill. And it acts like your tumble dryer. Your tumble dryer's got those veins in it, and they lift the clothes up, and they drop them, right? And they lift the clothes up, and it goes around like that. This works exactly the same. It lifts the rock up, and it drops it, and it smashes it to pieces. It then gets small, about this big, and it goes over to something called a ball mill. The ball mill acts like your washing machine. Your washing machine, the clothes stay in the bottom and they tumble over each other, right? Sorry guys, I'm explaining something you've probably never seen, all right? And that grinds it down into a small paste, and then it goes into the leach circuit. This is what the mine looks like. This is where the rock comes in. This is the mill building, the one that I just showed you. And then there's leach tanks here, and the gold recovery system is there. This one's an interesting building because the waste that comes out of this is called tailings. And this particular mine had filters on the tailings, like your filter for your coffee. So they press the water out of that so they could stack it safely in that particular area because it's a very seismic area. So what we wanted to do was to get it to be very stable. If you put it out there as tailings, as a slurry, what they call a slurry, which is like a thick paste, right? Like porridge, oatmeal. Sorry, went back to my English roots there, porridge or oatmeal. Then it's not as stable. You put it out as a solid, and it's quite stable in the area. And then this is what we're all looking for. That. This is the gold pour. Once you finish the gold recovery, they get this kind of massive slag, they heat it up, and we pour it out. And this is actually the first gold pour that they did at the mine. And we get gold bars. Each gold bar is probably worth nowadays about, $800,000 to $1 million. I know, it's ridiculous. The price of gold just went up. I had some shares in a gold mining company that I used to work for, and my shares went up, so I was very pleased about that. Now, to build a mine, you can't just do what the Spanish did, and those of you who were here at Richard's talk this morning, the Spanish just came in, took everything, and decided that was theirs. In the modern era, we work with the local communities, and we work with the local communities to make sure they get development, make sure they get jobs, make sure they get opportunities for improvement. Unfortunately, for the development of this mine, there were two communities, one called La Fundición, which actually means the foundry. So this is an old mining town from the 1800s, La Fundición. And then there was a little town here called Real de Limón. They were like two brothers who didn't get on. The two communities didn't want to be put together. But in order to build the mine, we had to move the two communities. So we went through an extensive negotiation, and I'll show you where we had to build it. This is a waste dump, which is where La Fundición was, and this is where Real de Limón was. And this is our new access road that we built. We had to build an access road into the mine, and the camp was right here, the mining camp was right here. So we negotiated with the two communities, and we ended up moving them to two new communities over here. We had suggested that it might be better for their infrastructure, etc., that they unite as a single community, but they decided no. So we did the relocation and resettlement of these two little communities out to over here. The communities before we moved them, they had no consistent water supply, there was no sewage system, the water system was just pipes running across the surface from a spring. And because of the old mining area that was in here around La Fundición, which means the foundry, there was a lot of arsenic in the water, so they were suffering from high arsenic concentrations in the water and that sort of thing. So the move was actually good. And at this particular time, before the mine came in, most of the community members had gone north to work. If you asked where your uncle was, he had gone to the north to work. So they'd gone into the US and they were living and working in the US. When we built the mine, we opened up jobs, opportunities, secondary development, and we reunited a lot of families. So we were able to, the uncle came back and came to live in his new house here. So it was quite an interesting piece. So this is an old view of La Fundición in 2013. It was a very rustic and rural area. Real de Limón, same thing, very rustic, rural. The interesting thing here is there was a graveyard that we actually managed to preserve. We made very special plans for the mine, from the access road and that sort of thing, that we were able to preserve the graveyard. We put a special fence around it, etc. So we moved these two communities, which were tin roofs, adobe walls, and we moved them over to these two communities here. Properly laid out. They had churches, they had basketball, proper schools. We supported the schools, we supported everything in the community to get it back on its feet. And you can see here, right on the very end, there is the sewage treatment system. So we added in proper water treatment, paved roads, and that sort of thing. And the community eventually decided they wanted to move. We had proper electricity, proper houses. Now, if you think about a community is a group of people, there are a lot of individuals, and we had one guy who didn't want to move. He was just not moving. He got his horse, he got his satellite dish, he's got his water, and he's not moving. So we spoke to his son, and we said to his son, we really want to, get this gentleman moved into his new house and get him all this kind of stuff. And he was living in those old communities on his own. He was quite happy. So the son said, well, you know what we'll do? We'll take down his satellite dish and we'll put it over at the new house. And sure enough, as soon as we put his satellite dish on the new house, he got on the truck, he tied his horse to the back of the truck, and we went slowly across the 3 kilometers across to the new community. So people are people. It was very interesting, and I'll tell you a few more stories about that. But you can't see people as a group, but you can see people as individuals, and each individual needs specific care and attention, as do we all. So, these lands and the land where the mine is are on lands called ejido lands. And the ejido lands in Mexico are lands that were given over to the communities in the 1918 agricultural change. So the government in 1918 took the lands from the large landowners and divided the lands up amongst these communities who were living in these particular areas. And the one thing about ejido lands in Mexico is you can't make each of the individual parcels smaller. So if I was given a parcel of land and I have 2 kids, I can only give the parcel of land to the 2 kids. I can't divide it. Whereas in Peru, you can divide the land into smaller and smaller parcels. In this particular case, you have to keep the land as a certain parcel because you can then produce enough food off of that to feed your family. The other person has to go somewhere else. And it's a very complicated piece. The original owners of the land in the old Real de Limon and old La Fundición didn't have title to their lands. So what we had to do in order to actually then lease the lands from them is we had to register everybody's land with the government through a lawyer. Then we could enter into a legal contract to lease the land from them, and then we could go ahead and build the mine. That takes about 2 to 3 years, so you can understand how important this job is. And then you obviously get beautiful things like this. This is one of those, everybody likes those signs. La Fundición put the signs in here. This is the basketball court, and here is one of the houses. And you can see the houses in the background here, tiled roofs, glass windows, fences, and they're all brick. And these are the proud new owners of the houses. They got full title to their homes, so they could legally move them and sell them whenever they wished. And you can see here, this gentleman obviously works for the mine. So he got a job at the mine, he got his house relocated, and his uncle came home. And the very important thing here is that we were also able to give rights to the women in the area. So you can see here, 2 ladies with their title to their house. Women actually were following this. The women had the right to the house. It was a legal, proper description. And it was registered with the government. So they could sell it, get money for it, etc. The place where I lived, for part of the time, I lived in the camp, a little bit of the time, but I lived in this place called Nuevo Balsas. Now you'll see a pattern here. Nuevo Balsas, we had Nuevo Real de Limon and Nuevo La Fundición. Nuevo Balsas used to be here. When the government built the dam, Nuevo Balsas was inundated and they had to move it. So Nuevo Balsas itself, when we look at it in a little bit more detail, you'll see that it has a layout similar to the one that we did. So Nuevo Balsas was a collection of people. Before the mine, there were about 200 people living there. Everybody had left. It was very violent. It was very difficult with the cartels. And we had about 200 people living there. And Richard mentioned this morning, when you get to know an area, you get to know the people, then you get kind of to be part of the family. And that's the way I had to do it. I lived in the town. I lived in the village. And it was a really lovely little community once we got the mine started to be developed. Because then the people came home. And we went from about 200 people to about 1,200 people, back to its full capacity, back to its proper population. The mine did things like put coffee shops in and that sort of thing. There's a Saturday market. We built a gym. This is actually part of the Saturday market. You can buy all kinds of stuff there. Some of the stuff you want, some of the stuff you don't. But there's a Saturday market. We invited the local restaurants to provide lunch at the mine on Sundays, all that kind of thing. It was really quite a lot of fun. So Nuevo Balsas itself, we had kind of a lasting impact on the community, and I just want to run through a few of the projects that we did. I don't have a lot of photographs, but I'll just talk through them as to what we did. So in Mexico, there are excellent programs for support for agriculture, support for fisheries, support for all kinds of development at the base level to support the people. The fishermen that were in Nuevo Balsas, and you saw it on the edge of the lake there, were not registered. They didn't have a cooperative. So they couldn't get access to government funds. So the first thing that the mine did was they took all of the fishermen and got them together, and they formed several little cooperatives. And they were actually, then we, as the mine, were able to register these cooperatives. The fishermen were then able to access government funds. They were able to get new motors for their boats. They were able to get nets that were given by the government so they could fish properly. We had a better road going from the mine to the outside world. There was a better road, therefore, from Nuevo Balsas to the outside world, so the fishing catch could then be distributed out to other areas. And I'll show you a photograph. The very last photograph that I put up will show you that they had, eventually we put in a fish packing plant. The mine put in a fish packing plant so that then they could then freeze the catch and send it off to market. We did investment in agriculture. As you can see in the area, it was very rudimentary. People didn't have anything really. So we brought in the government agriculture people. And the government agriculture people came in and they evaluated livestock, they evaluated the goats, they evaluated the pigs, and then we were able to get injections, we were able to bring in people to teach and get a better approach to agriculture in the area. Agriculture productivity almost doubled in the area. People were able to then sell their product to the mine. If you are growing tomatoes, the mine needs like 500 kilos of tomatoes, half a ton of tomatoes a week. So you can sell your tomatoes to the mine. And it was really quite interesting. One of the government programs that is covered mining in Mexico, there's a 7.5% tax on the mines. This 7.5% tax at the time used to go to a development fund. The development fund, so the money comes from the mine, it goes to the development fund, and then the communities apply to the development fund to fund some of their projects that they want in their community. However, in order to apply to the development fund, you had to have a properly written out project with engineering drawings and designs and all that kind of stuff. So, in a community that's a rural community, that's in the backwoods, that doesn't have very good education, they don't have much access to the development funds. So what I did was I hired an engineer to work with the communities. So the engineer, he had a year to work on the community projects. The community would define the projects they want. The engineer would draw up all the drawings, he'd make sure that everything was done right, do everything so that we could get to the fund. And then they released the funds on a certain day. I can't remember when it was, middle of February, I think. We were standing at the door with the community leaders when they opened the door to release the funds, and we were the only communities, our communities were the only ones in all of Mexico to submit projects that first day. And we got projects like repairs to the Catholic Church, a highway crossing, upgrade to the school, a building for the teachers because the teachers there's nowhere for the teachers to live. So we had all of these projects that for just one engineer's salary, we were able to give access to hundreds of thousands of dollars of funding from the government, but just by thinking and understanding what we needed to do. Development of local businesses was also important. Development of local businesses was also important. And we needed to get our people from the camp, we needed to get our people from Nuevo Balsas, where they lived, up to the mine. In order to do that, you need transportation. So we were able to then hire vehicles, small minibus kind of things, to move the people from the local communities. We made funds available so that we connected them with funding available so that they could buy a minibus. We gave them a contract so that then they could actually generate cash from the mine. So the mine was getting their people to work, and it was also supporting the businesses in the local community. And it really also worked well for the restaurants. I'll tell you, in Nuevo Balsas, there was no Starbucks. But there's now 2 coffee shops that people have put in there so that they could do the mine. They could support the people from the mine. we had a catering contract because when you've got to feed about 2,000 people for lunch, you can't really mess around too much for lunches. You really can't. However, on a Sunday, we had a lesser group of people at the mine because it was the weekend. We allowed the local restaurants to come up to the mine and to offer food to our workers. We paid, obviously, for all of the food that they did. So Sunday lunch became an event. It became an event not only for the people at the mine, but an opportunity for the restaurant owners in Nueva Balsas to showcase their skills and abilities. And then from that, we actually developed little subcontracts for these restaurants. So if a restaurant was good, and the people liked it and they were able to supply it, we would say give all the lunches for the milling department, for the processing plant, all the lunches would then be supplied by that restaurant. So we actually were able to move that forward quite quickly, and it was quite interesting as we go. So I've got a few little stories, and these are just stories, anecdotes about communities, a little bit like Richard gave this morning. When I lived in Nueva Balsas, I lived in this little tiny house, not much bigger than my cabin, but a little bit. And outside, the way you advertise in these communities is they have a microphone, speakers on a stick, sitting up in the middle of the piece. And so whoever was selling stuff in the evening, like if you would, you just started up your little taco stand, somebody would come on and they'd speak into the microphone and they would blast this across the whole community about, Maria was selling tacos made of pork in this particular location and this, that, and the other. And they also had drinks. And every single time, always the drinks were very cold. So bebidas bien frías was exactly what they said every time. It didn't matter what it was, but you had cold drinks every time you go along. Anyway, one of the things that I did was I patronized the local restaurants, and anybody that was living in the community patronized the local restaurants. And being a community person, I was actually the VP of Environment, Community, Health, Safety, and Government Relations. And I always wanted to know what was going on in the village. So I used to go to this little restaurant for breakfast, and the lady would cook my eggs, and the owner of the restaurant would sit down with me, and he'd say, Senor Mark, and she'd say, Senor Mark, and then we'd start talking. Well, I wouldn't talk. She would talk. And she would talk, and she would talk. I'm eating my eggs, I'm drinking my coffee, I've got some freshly squeezed orange juice, maybe a little bit of papaya from the local community. I knew everything that went on in that community before 8 o'clock in the morning. It was really fabulous, right? Because she would tell me that this person was doing that, and that person, and somebody had bought a car, and somebody had done this, and they were getting married, and she was pregnant, and so I had all of this information, and I went back up to my team, and I said, okay, now we've got to take some flowers to this, we've got to do this, and we've got to do that. And it was a really great source. Not only was it a really good breakfast, right, but it was a great source of information to be in the community. And Richard mentioned this morning how important it is to be part of the community. When I was in Africa, there's a phrase there's an old English phrase, Monday's child is fair of face, Tuesday's child is full of grace. And in Ghana, West Africa, your second name is the day you were born on. Okay? So if you were Friday born, you were this, and Saturday born. But what they did in Ghana is they called all the white people Sunday born because they were lucky, because they were white. I don't know whether that's true or not, but that was what the local community said. So the name for Sunday born is Kwesi. And if you remember, you'll hear Kwesi quite a bit. And they call the white people Bruni. So a white person, if you went into the community and you were a white person, your name would be Kwesi Bruni. So I learned about this history piece, right? And I said, okay, well, I was born on a Friday. I wasn't born on a Sunday. So then I'm Kofi. And I don't know if you remember one of the leaders of the UN was Kofi Annan, right? Kofi Annan was from Ghana. Kofi was born on Friday. So I'd go into the community, and the people would say, hey, Kwesi. And I said, no, I'm Kofi Bruni. I'm the only Kofi Bruni. And pretty quickly, everybody, there were 100,000 people in the villages around the mine where I worked in Ghana. Everybody knew me when I came through the village as Kofi Bruni, because I was the only Kofi, because I understood the history and I understood the customs of the people. Anyway, just a couple more stories before we wrap up here. Trying to understand the communities is interesting, and trying to understand the way the mine interacts with the communities is also interesting. The mine is seen as this big thing, right? And the mine does grand gestures. You know, they'll build a school. They'll build doctor's quarters. I built a $400,000 police station in one thing because we said that we would build this big police station. So we spent $400,000 in it on a police station for a community that had about 1,000 people. Didn't really merit it, but we said we would do it, so we did it. I don't know who said they would do it. Probably somebody from exploration. Just a little dig at Richard there. He's right back there, waving at me. So when you look at these big things, you commit to these big things, and you have a big opening ceremony, and there's a ribbon cutting and all that kind of stuff. And then nothing happens for about 6 months to the individual. So one day, I was having coffee with a guy called David in Nueva Balsas, and he said, Mark, you don't buy me lunch. I was like, okay, I don't buy you lunch. So I got thinking about this, and we finished coffee and we talked about what we needed to talk about. And this little thing about you don't buy me lunch stuck in the back of my head. I was like, what does he mean you don't buy me lunch? So I got thinking about it, and I began to realize that for these big gestures that we were doing at the mine, nothing really trickled down to David or his family. So I got thinking, okay, well, that's easy to solve. So I went back to my team and I said, look, what I want you to do is I want you to spend $500 a month doing something that affects a lot of people. So I said, Mother's Day, you can have a little tea for mothers, right? Valentine's Day, you can have a little something for the mothers. The kids at school, when they graduate from high school, well, they weren't graduating from high school because we didn't have one, you give them a backpack. Every now and then you can go to the school and you can give them a box of pencils for each kid. So every month, we touched, not everybody, but we touched like a good portion of the community. And David came to me and he said, hey Mark, my niece just got a backpack with some pencils in it from the mine. And it was amazing how $500 a month with a little bit that my mom got tea, Father's Day, we did a little barbecue, that sort of thing. And it was amazing how that tiny little gesture was able to kind of turn the thinking around, and it brought the mind, that the mind not only affects me, it affects my family and that sort of thing. And I'll just tell you one last thing, we'll get rid of the last piece. So, we had signed an accord with one of the communities for some community support. And this is a safety thing, and it's really, really cool what happened. At the mine, at every mine, safety is first. Safety first and always, right? And I had a big campaign when I was in Ghana, if it's not safe, don't do it. We dropped the injury rates tremendously. But in Mexico, this was our local community. So I went to this local community and we were having a lunch. I took a driver. I had a driver. And Jose Luis Peralta, who was a very good friend of mine, he and I, we went to this opening lunch, and the ladies were cooking tacos, and we had real tacos sitting under a tree, and the community then breaks out the beers, so we're drinking beer and eating tacos and chatting away about, you know, community development, this kind of thing. And from a safety perspective, it was very interesting. It was a separate table. And I looked across, and there were some guys sitting at a separate table, and they all had Coca-Cola. I said, everybody else was in the mix, but there were about 10 guys over at the other table. So I said to the hosts, I said, why? Why are they over there? And he said, oh, they're all going to work tonight. They're not allowed to drink. So they knew that if you went on shift, you couldn't be drinking. And the community made the decision to keep their workers safe. And for me, that was a huge telltale piece that a community is making a collective decision to keep their workers safe by making it easy for them to participate in the party, but not get, you know, beers and that sort of thing. And it was a good job, because just after I'd said, why are they over there, and I had another taco, somebody reached under the table and put a great big bottle, and it was about this big, that looked like Johnny Walker Red was on the side of the bottle, but it was clear. And they started bringing out their local mezcal. And all of these bottles came from under the table and were put on the table. And they all had their favorite mezcal. And this is the illegal hooch that's just made wherever you could. So I had to test and approve of various mezcals during that day. So it was a really, really good job that I had my driver that day, I'll tell you. And I didn't do anything. We finished up about 4 o'clock, and I just went home and went to bed. That was a very interesting and exciting way to go about it. I've got 100 other stories. Richard's got 1,000 other stories, but anyway. It's not always easy dealing with communities. It's not always smooth sailing. In this particular case, we had blockades, we had strikes, we had all kinds of stuff. But eventually we got to an alignment with the communities. People came back, families were reunited, and it worked out quite well. In the mining business, you know, it's an unfortunate thing that we need to do in order to supply metals to the community. But in this particular case, with the jobs and the stability, and working with the communities and working to understand the communities, we were able to build a very complicated, high-tech mine. And we had every single laborer, every single non-skilled worker was from the local area. Every single skilled worker, non-salaried, was from Guerrero. And the majority of the rest of the workers were from Mexico themselves. We had 1 or 2 extremely specialized areas, people like me, that we brought in from the outside, but we had 10 expats. When I was the mine manager, we had 2,000 people and 10 expats, which for a mine that size and the complexity that it is an excellent opportunity. So by partnering with the people, we're able to do all kinds of fun stuff. And this is on the upper right. On the upper right, there we go. This is bags full of fish that we got the government to bring for us so that we could put them in the lake and release them. So we were able to release the fish into the lake. And later, these are the fishermen, and they caught them. And then just recently, and this is a very good friend of mine, Jose Luis Peralta, they opened a processing plant for the fishermen. So I consider, if you're working in a state like Estado Guerrero, where the development index is very low, where you've got the drug cartels everywhere, and we went from communities that were decimated to communities that were thriving with good infrastructure, good health, and good education. I think this is certainly a story to be proud of, and I'm very thankful to have been able to share that with you this afternoon. Thank you very much.